For some, the forehand throw comes naturally and they can develop a lot of power pretty easily. But for others, developing even a serviceable forehand takes a lot of time and effort. These are our tips to improving your forehand. The basis of a forehand grip is 2 fingers against the inside rim of the disc and your thumb on top. A lot of players will make the mistake of having their fingers sideways, so their pads of their fingers are pointing into the flight plate of the disc, and then they end up throwing with kind of this karate chop motion. The way I teach to grip is to turn your fingers into the rim more, because that means that as you're following through, your wrist has a much more natural motion, and it makes it a little bit easier to throw those hyzer shots. Some people, when throwing their forehands, will actually use the tips of their fingers into the rim rather than extending their fingers like I like to do. And that works. In my experience, it doesn't provide quite as much spin, and for me, it doesn't feel like I have as much control over the angle, but it does make it easier to turn your fingers a little bit more. And so if you're having trouble rolling your wrist, you might try this grip and see how it works for you. The other important part of a forehand grip is tucking the disc pretty deep into the webbing in between your fingers, your pointer and your thumb there, and make sure you're grabbing the disc pretty tightly on top with your thumb as well. The more surface area you're controlling of the disc, the more control you're going to have of your angles, and it's going to come out with a cleaner release, and you're going to get more spin on the disc that way. Some people will lean towards a 1-finger forehand grip, and this is generally for something like up shots or slower shots, but I don't like to teach this because it doesn't provide nearly as much control over the angle. You're not controlling as much of the disc. It's a little bit harder to be more precise with your angles. A lot of players will do this when they have trouble rolling their wrist on their release. And the way I teach to fix that is to turn your fingers into the rim a little bit more and make sure you follow through upwards. Because if your fingers are sideways and you roll your wrist, that is going to provide that wobble. It is going to turn the disc a little bit. But if your fingers are turned into the rim, your follow through is going to be more naturally in line with the disc. And that should help you have a lot more power than a 1-finger release without the wobble and the off-axis torque that can sometimes come with throwing with 2 fingers. As far as technique, I like to teach to start by pulling your wrist back, pulling your arm back, and then for the throw, lead with your elbow and extend forward to follow through. Now, a mistake that I see a lot of newer players make is they will throw with too much shoulder and not enough elbow, but that doesn't usually provide as much power because just like with a backhand, if you're throwing with your shoulder, your whole arm is going to be moving a lot slower. Leading with your elbow is something that a lot of people will talk about when they teach forehands, but it's important that you don't load your elbow too late. You don't want to start with your elbow back and then snap it forward right at the last second, because that will usually cause a lot of strain and a lot of inconsistency in your shot. I like to swing my elbow forward as I reach the disc back. So as I swing the disc back, as I'm kind of doing that shuffle step, I will swing the disc back and then try and keep my elbow a little bit farther forward there so that I can get the extension and the snap on the disc later. Follow through is just as important in a forehand as it is in a backhand. It's important to make sure that you follow through forward first. That's something that Eric Oakley talks an awful lot about, is making sure that your follow through is down the fairway rather than across your body or you're standing up too much or something like that. You want to follow through forwards and push the disc down the fairway with your follow through. That's going to help a lot with those hyzer flip releases, and it's going to help you keep the disc on that line that you started on. Another thing is weight shift. It's important to make sure that your weight shifts all the way over your front foot as you're throwing. I like to teach people should be leaning forward after their throw. If you're struggling with this like I do, you want to make sure that you're leaning forward so your weight has all the way shifted onto your front foot by the time the disc is released. For choosing your forehand disc, it can be tempting to start out with something fast and overstable, but it's not really going to provide that much control. The other end of the spectrum is kind of tricky too. If you've ever tried to forehand like a putter or a straight mid-range, it can be pretty hard to get a clean release on it. And so for most of us, the sweet spot is around a 9-speed. You don't necessarily want to choose the most overstable disc that you can find either, because again, that's going to forgive a lot of your mistakes and it's going to prevent you from improving your throw, and it's just going to be basically a crutch that you're limping along with and just getting that token shot out of. Another thing to look for in your forehand disc is a flat top. You want to make sure that something has a flat top because a dome can make the angle in your hand feel different than the angle that you're throwing on. a lot of people will get a much cleaner release out of a flat top forehand disc. And like I said, a lot of people will choose something really overstable. I like something a little bit straighter for most of my forehands. I like a Sargent or something like a Convict is good as well, because it's not going to dump as early, so I can get a little bit more distance out of it, and it's going to encourage that hyzer release. It's going to encourage starting the disc on that hyzer, pushing that angle, and if you can master the hyzer flip forehand throw, that is a very deadly weapon to have in the woods. As far as when to throw forehands, for the most part, I'm going to choose a forehand anytime I can and the shot goes left to right. I like being able to keep the disc on a hyzer rather than having to turn it over, especially in the woods. Because if you've ever thrown an anhyzer in the woods and it kicks a tree late, if it's rotating for a backhand but moving right, it's going to kick a tree and go very far the other direction. Whereas a forehand throw is more likely to kick towards the target and maybe still give me a putt. I'm also going to choose a forehand for most upshots if I have a right to left wind, because it's going to be easier for me to keep the top of the disc into the wind, and that's going to prevent it from lifting and getting carried offline, and I find I'm a lot more accurate with a right to left wind when I'm throwing a forehand. I find if I'm in a situation where I have limited range of motion, a forehand is a lot easier to throw because I don't have to turn all the way away from the target and follow through all the way. I can just kind of flick my arm and flick my wrist and still get a serviceable forehand out there. Also, because a forehand throw doesn't require you to turn away from the target, it can be easier to keep your eye on a gap if you're throwing a forehand. So if I have a dead straight, maybe 150-foot shot with a super tiny gap in front of me, I'm probably going to throw a forehand just because it's going to be easier for me to hit that gap and keep that straight flight the whole time. So those are our tips for how to improve your forehand. Let us know what you think down in the comments. Let us know any tips that you have for throwing forehands and anything that really helped you when you were starting out. Thanks for watching. Make sure you subscribe so you don't miss any other content on how to become a better disc golfer from Dynamic Discs, and we'll see you next time.